So Nate, I'm here today to talk to you about your second book is actually coming out.
Yeah.
And so you released a book quite a bit ago, I think it was 2011, 2012, and this book is coming out not only as a sequel, but as a standalone book to that first one. Can you tell us a little bit about what it's all about?
Yeah, so the first book really was something that I wrote kind of as an offspring of my recovery from chemical dependency and resulting neurological disorder that I developed as a consequence of a brain injury that I sustained during the course of that chemical dependency. At the time, I was still a woman, and through the course of writing that book, a lot of things came back to the surface for me that I recognized had actually been very important in terms of my identity, and that I had been confusing my sexual orientation with my gender identity for much of my life. So what surfaced then in 2011 as I was putting the finishing touches on this first book ended up being another kind of issue to address for me in terms of some of the battles that I thought I had kind of put in the closet, so to speak. All of a sudden were kind of coming out of the closet, and I needed to embrace that. But unfortunately, I did have some setbacks first, including an attempt to take my life that put me in a coma. So getting out of that coma, thankfully cognitively intact, was definitely a time when I felt that I really needed to learn to embrace my identity and take that courageous step of moving forward with my gender transition. It's a complicated thing to do when you're living with a mental health diagnosis on top of a neurological disorder. It's a very challenging experience to have. So getting the green light to move forward was kind of difficult. So my book will really be exploring kind of the dynamics of how the layered identity can really complicate the process of gender transition, and in fact, in some cases, impair people's ability to move forward with their gender transition. So there is a sociological component to it, but it is primarily a memoir regarding my own experiences.
All right. So when you were explaining that, to explain to some of our listeners, you said you were confusing your gender identity with your sexuality. And for some people, that's still confusing. Can you clear up how you identified which is which?
Sure. Well, as a young child, I knew from a very young age that, I guess in my words, I was supposed to be a boy. I told my mom to take me back and have me fixed, essentially. It was something that just felt very natural and pure to me. So I was very in tune with my gender and what I wanted from a young age. But I also got messages on the school playground that the black big wheels are for the boys and the pink ones are for girls, so you have to go sit on the pink big wheels. Similar messages that I got from my family and peers and teachers at school. And that, I think, really kind of complicated some of my understanding of my own identity as I got into my adolescence, because that's when we start to think more about our sexuality. And so once I discovered about age 18 that, hey, I really like girls, I thought that that explained everything in terms of my gender differences. So I was not able to really understand that difference between my own sexuality and gender identity for about another 15 years before I was able to really see that there's a very different thing going on, and that sex assigned at birth and how I express my gender is a very different thing from who I'm attracted to. And I think that recognition as an adult was what really brought back to the surface a lot of what I knew about myself from a very young age in terms of my gender.
Okay. So you cover other hard topics besides gender identities and sexualities. You also talk about your struggle with addiction and the consequences of that in your second book. Would you mind elaborating a little bit on that for us?
Sure, yeah. So a lot of that is covered within my first book, Running on a Mind Rewired, but I think that is really important in setting up some of the complexities that folks are facing that are gender nonconforming or specifically transgender that are undergoing a transition process. And that there are a lot of common factors there that are underlying, and that may be, in hindsight, I think a way that I was self-medicating and trying to kind of fit into a world that I had been given the message for so long that you don't fit in, that was kind of a way to fit in, was by kind of through that self-medication. And definitely we see high rates of addiction, suicide, mental health challenges within folks that are within the transgender community, and I think a lot of that really can circle around those same kind of issues that led me into that place of addiction. So I wanted to touch on that in this book in terms of, A, that was definitely not something unique to me. That's a common factor that we'll often see folks kind of go down that road. But also I wanted to address the consequences, that's something that then led to the neurological condition that could have potentially impaired my ability to transition because of some of the concerns the surgeons had, in particular taking muscles to taking a scalpel to muscles that might be dysfunctional because of this neurological condition, or asking me to start hormones that could potentially exacerbate some of the emotional fluctuations that are kind of inherent to my mental health challenges.
Okay. So taking a look at your new book, it was also a part of your thesis for graduating from your master's degree in Hamlin, correct? So what is that like to see that something that you worked so hard on to get a degree is also being used as like a stepping stone and another part of your life?
It's pretty amazing, to be honest. It's a very different process than what I did with my first book, and this felt very much more like I had a lot of folks that were working with me to make sure that I had the best product possible. I think there is something of a challenge in releasing a second book, much the way that musicians will tell you at the sophomore album, there's a lot of pressure. So this was definitely something that I felt I wanted to put forth my effort all throughout, and having that team kind of community support at Hamlin was incredibly helpful for me, because this was a very tough topic to dive into. So having peers that could give me feedback, that I could talk with and develop friendships with, that was really important as I worked through a lot of these kind of dark and heavy memories.
And you've recently released the cover art for your new book, and for those listening over the radio, it's a white book with a black tie with the title "Dying to Hang with the Boys" on the front. Can you tell me, how did you pick out that art? Because it's very striking.
Well, thank you. The concept was actually something that I had in mind for quite a while in terms of the tie. I don't like to discuss too much about means of suicide, but I think being important that I did attempt to take my life by hanging with a black tie. And a lot of that was symbolic, in the sense the tie represents manhood. It represented something that I wasn't able to put my foot out in the world, I guess, and was never able to actually wear that tie that I ended up trying to take my life with. So that tie really kind of became something that was symbolic to me in terms of the suicide attempt itself, but also just that gender component and what is expected of a man in presentation and role and dress and all of that. So that was kind of a concept I had in mind, and I've been fortunate to have a wonderful team that I've been working with on the publication of this book, including Mr. Brad Knorr, who's just a wonderful cover designer. So he kind of took some of what I gave him in terms of my ideas with the tie and brought it to life and really made that happen. So I tip my cap to him.
So your first book was published under your birth name, Jennifer, and now this book is published under your chosen name, Nate. What emotions do you feel when you look at that cover, you see the symbolism of the tie, and then you see your name at the bottom on the byline?
It is kind of surreal yet. I don't know that I've quite gotten used to that. I've gotten so used to crossing out Jennifer and writing Nate on my previous book that it's going to be strange to not do that going forward with the second book, because it's already there. So it feels more authentic to me. And for a while, I really did want to just kind of throw that last book away and just say, you know what, Jennifer's gone. I'm now legally, hormonally, physically Nate. This is who I am. Forget that. But much as we know about history in general, if I forget my own history and don't embrace that, I might end up going down some of those same paths in terms of catastrophic mental health collapse or falling back into addiction. And those are things that I don't want to do. So been quite a journey.
Moving on, what do you want people to get out of this book? Even if they've read the first one, if they haven't read the first one, what do you want people to take away when they finish this book, close it, and put it down?
My hope is that they gain a little bit of insight into what it's like to be living in a different kind of world or a different upbringing. And I think that's something that we're all challenged by right now in a very diverse world where we're really trying to understand each other's viewpoints and come together to find common ground. That I'm hoping that this will be kind of a bridge to help communities come together. That there is a lot of separation within some of the sub-communities that I belong to, within the disability community, within the LGBT community. It can be very challenging. And so I think just being authentic about that and being transparent about some of the challenges that you face in terms of belonging, I think can be very empowering, because those folks that might read that will then know that they're not alone. And they might be able to obtain from that too a little bit, just a little bit of knowledge that might help carry them forward, either as someone who's facing current challenges or has a family member facing those similar kinds of challenges, or as a provider.
Giving them the opportunity to learn from you rather than finding their own way. All right, so you're not only just an author, you're also a speaker who goes around, and you recently have been featured in a new exhibit at the Minnesota Art Museum?
The Science Museum.
Minnesota Science Museum, excuse me. So you've been featured in the Minnesota Science Museum. Can you tell us about that exhibit, and does it tie back to your book at all, or is it just more on your list of speaking events?
It's been a wonderful opportunity. I was just thrilled to have been chosen as one of the featured stories there within the exhibit, and certainly it's been just amazing to see how they've used some of the advertisements. So it's been wonderful. It definitely does tie into this book in the sense that what is there in the exhibit for folks to hear in terms of the story that I shared there at the exhibit on video is very similar to what is elaborated on in my book, and will obviously go into more detail within the book and be much more inclusive in terms of just drawing the reader in and having kind of a reader experience. The exhibit itself is designed to really educate consumers as well as providers on mental health history, the challenges that folks living with mental health diagnoses have faced, and also integrate folks into what it might be like to, for example, hear voices. So they certainly have a warning up there that if you have experience hearing voices, that this might not be the best fit. But I think it's done a great job of really helping reduce the stigma of mental illness, which is something that's been a big goal for a lot of organizations, and something I definitely champion.
So some of your other speaking adventures have been outside the museum, and even including training with the St. Paul Police. Would you be willing to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I've done quite a bit of work now with law enforcement and corrections, and both working through the National Alliance on Mental Illness and discussing mental health, and subsequently then working with them on how to better serve the transgender community. It's kind of a difficult subject within the area of corrections, and definitely it's a binary system. We know that. So that's something that has been creating a lot of challenges for both law enforcement as well as correctional settings. And I've found it very helpful to be out there to be able to talk with officers as well as folks that might work within the jails and prisons about how they can better serve these communities, and was just thrilled to hear from the St. Paul Police a few months ago when they reached out and asked me to come in and do their in-service trainings for their new transgender and gender nonconforming policy. And I think that's something that we're seeing more departments bringing on right now, so that we're making sure that folks are treated with the dignity and respect that they deserve. And so I've been very honored to be a part of that and be able to help train some of our officers out there and make sure that they're able to be out there and serve with the respect and dignity that I know that they want to provide to the people that they do serve. So it's a tricky sociological issue right now, but I think being out there and being able to work with the police, it's not something I ever would have thought that I would be doing when I was using chemicals, for example. But it feels like a natural fit right now. Yeah, it's been a wonderful experience. And through NAMI, I've been able to give, I think, over about 120 presentations now for them. And I've just been thrilled with the accolades and just the wonderful support that they've been able to provide, and made some wonderful friends through the organization. And it's really become one of my great coping skills that I really rely on, being able to get out there and kind of verbally vomit out to these audiences and share the story in the hopes that it'll help someone else.
So in your first book, you talked quite a bit about your role as playing hockey in high school. And I've noticed going through your Facebook page and your personal website, you've been running a lot of marathons. And so how have you made that transition? Like, do you not play hockey anymore? Have you replaced it with running marathons, or is that just something new that you've picked up?
Hockey was something that, unfortunately, given the shoulder dislocation I had when I was young, and then I went through years of chemical dependency, and of course, when we're adolescents and in our early 20s, we're invincible, so I didn't bother to get it fixed. And so when I got sober and developed my neurological disorder, that became something that I actually couldn't get fixed. And that challenged me. Hockey's a very one-sided kind of sport in the sense that you really have to lean. And that is actually kind of challenging for the body. It's also challenging for the brain. So from a neurological standpoint, there's a lot of evidence to support that reciprocal motion that's balanced can be very, very helpful for our nervous system. I had found that running was a great high when I first got sober. And so with the loss of hockey, that worked out really well for me to be able to kind of work into a different sport that trained my brain in a different way. And it turned out to be really a blessing, because when I did then develop dystonia, it turned out to be a great coping mechanism as well, and very helpful for my nervous system. So it's been something that's been crucial, I think, for my recovery. And it's also been a key piece of my the gender transition, I will say, in that a lot of what you did see in terms of marathons, races, things were separated out by gender, and it's changed. We're seeing less races that have an F to designate female, and there's just been a lot of changes in that way that I think has been really wonderful. So it's been neat to see how there has been less separation among men and women in terms of that sport, and that it's not quite as divided among times or identifiable gender by race bib. And the Twin Cities Marathon was actually wonderful in working with me when I first requested to not have the F on my race bib. I was concerned that if I had an injury, if I fell, they would need to know my legal name. And if I was racing as a male and hadn't yet changed my name, that could be a problem. But they were very understanding of that, and they were very embracing of it. So it's been a big piece of how I've kind of worked through some of my gender transition as well.
It's very cool.
Yeah.
So how many marathons have you ran in?
14.
Wow.
That surprises me when I say that, because actually after the first one I had said, I'm never doing this again, please don't ever sign me up for this again. And then about 3 months later, I just kind of got this itch that was actually not as bad as I thought, and maybe I want to do that again. So it ends up becoming something that I think it's a great goal setting. It gives me something to look forward to, and it keeps me disciplined, definitely. And it's a wonderful way for me to kind of work through some of my thoughts. With my bipolar racing thoughts, and having too many thoughts can be kind of a challenge. So I find when I'm out there running, I can just really process through a lot of things that otherwise I might not be able to or not have time.
Very cool. Well, I am excited to get my hands on it as soon as it comes out. Is there anything else in the book that you'd like to talk about? Any teasers or that you'd like to give away?
I guess I've found it very challenging as a person living with a mental health diagnosis to move forward with gender transition. That was something that I ran into a lot of roadblocks, and at that time a lot of gatekeeping, unfortunately, that I don't think is uncommon. And it's been my impression that other individuals have faced similar challenges, and my hope is that by kind of bringing that to light, that folks will see that, for a lot of folks, that really is a life and death situation, that there really isn't an option, that it's a must, not an if. And for a lot of folks, I think that needs to be kind of on their timeline. So I think we've seen a lot of changes since I started my gender transition, and a lot of what I want to address in this book are those changes. That my surgery, for example, was not covered. And so that was something that, I worked 2 jobs, 7 days a week to make sure that I was able to pay for that. And now we're seeing the litigation come out and the rules change regarding the necessity of coverage. So those are the kinds of things that I think are important to bring to light and to bring out in the book and discuss these kind of challenging sociological issues that we're faced with right now, definitely in this day and age where there is a lot going on, and embracing diversity is not always as easy as we might think it might be. So trying to kind of just give a voice to a story that is not unique to me, but that might be a voice that hasn't been heard, I think is incredibly important right now.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Yeah, thank you.